thank you, Mr. Goldberg, that you have a moment to talk with me. We had a chance to meet on Monday, but yeah, my first question would be, what are you actually doing? What is your background?
So I'm the director, my name is David Theo Goldberg, I'm the director of the University of California Humanities Research Institute, which serves all 10 universities of the University of California system, as well as the executive director of the MacArthur funded and supported Digital Media and Research Hub based on the campus of the University of California, Irvine, which I run with Mimi Ito, and I also oversee the now international Digital Media and Learning competition, which runs more or less annually. And I hold professorial positions at UC Irvine in comparative literature, anthropology, and criminology law and society.
Okay. Just taking this up, the contest, what was exactly asked for there? What kind of submissions did you receive?
Right, so we've completed 4 full cycles of competitions, so 4 different competitions, starting narrowly in 2000, I think it was 8, 7 or 8, aimed really at just American applicants and institutions, trying to surface innovative work in digital media and learning, app development, and so on. And we thought we might get 500 applicants, and we got over 1,000, and ended up funding, I think that year, about 15 projects, 15 projects. And then we sort of opened it up each year. It was on gaming and kids focused the following year. And we opened it up to a limited number of international really countries with which we or the MacArthur Foundation had some kind of relationship. And then in the 3rd year, we opened it up completely internationally. And each year we've gotten, the average has been about 700, 750 applications. Because as we opened it up geographically, we've actually narrowed the focus a little bit. And in the most recently completed competition cycle, we focused really on badging as alternative forms of assessment, accreditation, as a way of both surfacing, motivating and surfacing learning, recognizing that learning and the learning pathways, and being able to accredit that learning through the provision of a digital badge. We work very closely with the Mozilla Foundation's open badging infrastructure, which formed the basic platform, really.
Right.
So any award-winning project would have to be at least interoperable, fully interoperable with the OBI that Mozilla produced. And what we do is they're not prizes, they're really 1-year grants, development grants. And then we work in that year very closely with the award winners to shape and develop in both webinars and phone calls and online meetings and a couple of face-to-face meetings over the year. And they expected to present their material both to each other and to publics along the way.
And could you give us maybe one example of the ones that were selected this year?
Yeah, so they've ranged over a really interesting group. We've largely focused in the competition on badge applications, ecology, systems of badging for youth learning, really what we call in America K through 12, so grade 1 through grade 12, or kindergarten through grade 12, with 1 or 2 exceptions. And so the projects have ranged from, for example, a very effective after-school program in Providence, in the Providence area, so the Providence After School Alliance, where they would develop learning applications for kids after school, and we're in agreement with the school district in Providence, in Rhode Island. They would agree to accredit certain kinds of learning systems and programs that the school system would then accept as credit towards coursework to cover certain areas that the school system has done. Another would be NASA in partnership with a not-for-profit organization developed a badging system for the robotics program, the robotics learning program that NASA had developed for youth. And the badge system accredited the learning pathways and learning outcomes for hands-on learning about robotics that NASA had provided. And then a range of others. There was an agricultural program at the University of California, Davis that won an award to accredit actually university college level learning in agricultural systems and so on. So a very wide range of applications.
Sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the direction how things are developing in overall in higher education, now in digital dynamics, we talked about it on Monday. You made a very strong claim in my memory about the connectivity dimension of learning and how this may affect and challenge the higher education system. Could you maybe wrap up a bit the idea behind it?
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly everybody's engaging, or just about everybody is engaging in one way or another in technology-enabled connections, right? I mean, whether those connections are mobile through smartphones or other mobile technologies, iPads and so on, or whether it's more what we've come to regard now as more conventional modes of connectivity. Clearly, people are acquiring knowledge or learning in a variety of ways throughout their day, right? In interaction with each other, in engagements with each other, in formal and informal, in institutional and extra-institutional kinds of settings. So the landscape, the context has changed quite dramatically from the little red schoolhouse, right, that some of us grew up with, right? So before online was even imagined in some of our imagery. So the sense now is that learning takes place pretty much anywhere, anytime. I mean, that's almost a cliche we've come to adopt, right? People learn from peers, they learn from each other, they learn in interactions, they learn from elders, adults learn from youth, because youth are more facile in some ways than adults are, and so on. So there's a very complex, multi-directional engagement around learning that technology has enabled. And in some ways, I mean, that has been liberating. It's allowed us to think somewhat differently about learning as opposed to institutionally imposed education, if you want to put it in those terms. Sort of authoritative education on the one hand, and peer-to-peer and engaged, interest, passion-driven learning on the other, just to make the contrast broad, right? So in some ways it's been quite liberating, but there's also been a cost, as there often is with these things, and the cost is that quite often the technology and the kind of romance with the technology has come to drive the learning possibilities. So even as it's liberated and opened up, it's actually also closed down in some respects, right? And that closing down means, I mean, you just think about MOOCs, or at least the initial iteration of MOOCs. It assumed a very conventional mode of learning that it then kind of folded into the romance with that form of technology, and the kind of democratization of education through large numbers, and so instead of fear of small numbers, we're now fearing large numbers, right? And so on and so forth. So the innovation got tempered by the lack of innovation, or the lack of a kind of innovative imaginary, right? And so what we've been pushing, and what we stand for at the Digital Media and Learning Research have is a notion that I'll complicate after I say it, where the learning drives the technology rather than the technology drives the learning, right? So that thinking about effective learning first and foremost, where the learning is peer-to-peer, where it's engaged, where it's passion and interest-driven, where it's takes place whenever anybody is sort of moved and mobilized by it and so forth. All these things should drive the kinds of technologies that then further enable those forms of learning we find to be effective, rather than imposing a single model, right, on learning and say this is how you ought to learn, which seems to be a throwback, even if slightly different, but a throwback to the older forms. And so I want to say that different people learn in different ways, and they learn at different times in different ways, in different contexts in different ways. And somehow we should imagine the technology enabling each of those possibilities, right? Basically leveraging those possibilities and ramifying them, opening them up and making them even more available and effective. And so, we've been, so I want to complicate that in a little bit, really in relation to some of the things that have been said both last night and through the day today. And so the first thing to say is that, of course, there's a kind of, call it a kind of dialectical interaction between the learning and the technology, right? So as the learning should drive the technology, the technological innovation then makes us rethink learning possibilities, right, as the technology is applied, without closing down the effectivity of the learning practices that we find effective. So that's one form of the complication. And then the other form of the complication, I think, was something John C.D. Brown was stressing today, and that is context. And that speaks to the fact that we learn differently in different contexts, and different people learn differently when they're in different contexts, and so on. And that then complicates the interaction between the learning and the technology.
Yeah. Just as a final question, I really find this is very thought-provocative, especially if you look at some trends that we have discussed now during the last days as well. In the let's say overall picture, how much do you see these approaches growing within the formal educational system, or is this something that rather takes place in the outskirts?
Yeah, it's a very interesting and important and quite complex question, right? So the MacArthur Initiative in Digital Media and Learning, which started out about 9 years ago, and started out as a $50 million 5-year foundation initiative, and has since expanded both temporally and in terms of the amount of funding they're throwing at it, almost threefold, right? It's gotten quite big and capacious, and has had really important developments. So they realized at the beginning that $50 million over 5 years, $2 million a year, was going to have very little, if any, impact on institutional schooling in America, which is very complex, right? State by state, even having an really political, control by all kinds of forces and so on. So it's very, very difficult to move that and impact it in any way. So they made a very smart choice, and that was to try and impact those institutional arrangements that surrounded the schools rather than the schools directly themselves. After school programs, museums, libraries, community engagements, where kids, the realization was that learning, and even the most effective learning, wasn't necessarily taking place in bureaucratically driven schools. It was taking place in peer-to-peer engagements after school in these really imaginative and creative kinds of programming, where kids were doing hands-on, maker, remixing kinds of engagements. And that ramped up over the many years of the initiative, and has been really quite effective in a variety of ways that one can follow up on and read on. But it's also backed into the schools, right? So
also in higher education,
and it's starting to impact higher education. higher education is almost slower to change than schools, right? I mean, these are big institutional apparatuses. My colleagues are fixed in their ways, right? They the sage on the stage, they like to stand in front of a classroom and impart their extensive knowledge to almost passively sitting students in front of them who sit in awe of them for the most part. That model is largely over because kids are learning everywhere, right? And those who are getting a more creative mode of education in K through 12 are now entering higher education and going, oh my God, this is not what we expected, right? And so, there's been a response. I mean, it's starting to gather steam both in traditional youth schooling and now in higher education, that we have to go to be more creative. And what technology has enabled, and what the MOOC phenomenon has really, I think the most important development is not the MOOCs as such, MOOCs themselves, right? I mean, it's technology, right? But what it's done is to unsettle the ground of thinking about what effective learning really is and where it takes place, right? So that classroom, institutionally forward kind of classroom convention where, a smart teacher is conveying their knowledge to more or less passive students is now under considerable pressure. And in higher education, I mean, what is happening is that the blended or hybrid or flipped classroom has now become, a topic of conversation. And, one can send students home to look at interesting online material, lectures online or whatever, and they can do that outside the classroom. And then the face-to-face, right, which doesn't have to be passively sitting in front of a screen or in front of an expert teacher, can be used for more effective interactive collaborative engagements where the students are learning peer-to-peer so the connectivity actually flips and transforms and poses the question, which is not easily closed down, what is effective learning and under what conditions and in what context?
Well, thank you very much for this brief overview. I'm sure that this will have a triple effect to the ones that are listening. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.